He was 72 calm, dressed in a wool coat, holding nothing but a newspaper and a name. In less than 5 minutes, he was cuffed, searched, and humiliated in the street, not because he broke the law, but because the officer didn't bother to ask who he was. What that officer didn't know, Langston Hill once rewrote federal law, and today he was about to rewrite something much bigger, an entire system. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Charleston had always known how to stay quiet. The cobbled streets lined with magnolia trees and history too heavy to retell carried secrets in their cracks. Tourists came for its charm, its pastel facades and whispers of antebellum grandeur, but rarely looked long enough to see what the silence was hiding. On a Tuesday morning that began like any other, the city met its reckoning. It started not with sirens, but stillness. Langston Hill had driven that same route every Tuesday for the past 17 years. Jefferson Avenue to Watermark Street, then the back alley behind a small used bookstore where he picked up the same newspaper, folded the same way, greeted with a nod by a man who never asked questions. Langston preferred it that way. Routine was not just comfort, it was control. A 72-year-old man in a crisp wool coat, beard like cotton silver, and hands that once penned federal legal reform, Langston moved through life like he belonged to a different time. He didn't talk about his past. People just whispered it when he passed by. Professor, architect of policy, a man who once testified before Congress and then walked away from it all. That morning, the sun sat low and gold behind a thin veil of clouds. Langston's silver Buick crept through intersections not out of fear, but precision. He had taught himself long ago that urgency invited suspicion. That was a lesson passed down, not learned in books. As he parked, he noticed a patrol car 2 blocks down, idling, facing the opposite direction. No lights, no motion. He didn't flinch. He stepped into the bookstore, nodded at the clerk, grabbed his newspaper. A murmuring red light reflected on the shop's front glass just once, then again. The kind of light that didn't ask, but warned. As he turned to leave, Langston paused. The reflection lingered. Something in him clenched not from fear, but from memory. Back in the car, he didn't start the engine right away. He simply looked up into the rearview mirror, not expecting to see anything, but needing to prove to himself that he could still hold someone's gaze without blinking. The patrol car had crept forward, still no sirens, just presence, just assumption. Langston breathed in, deep, measured. He knew what would follow. He had lived this scene in different variations too many times to count, but he was older now, slower, and most dangerously unafraid. The officer didn't announce himself with urgency. He took his time. Parked his cruiser, deliberately lights, flashing softly like it was a favor. Then he stepped out. Tall, white, barely 30, a tight jaw, and sunglasses worn like armor. He approached with a pace that screamed performance. Langston rolled down his window 2 inches. Nothing more. His eyes remained forward. License and registration, came the voice. Mechanical. Empty. Langston didn't ask why. He didn't argue. He reached slowly, precisely handed over the documents, and returned his hands to the steering wheel. The officer stared. "Where are you going, sir?" "To pick up a book." "This early?" "I believe in reading while the world sleeps." The officer didn't laugh, didn't smirk, just stepped back, scanned the ID, then stared again. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Langston turned. Finally, not fast, not startled, but with a look that didn't ask permission to exist. "Am I being detained?" The officer hesitated, just long enough for Langston to see it. Then came the lie dressed in authority. Non-compliant behavior. Step out. Langston opened the door. He moved like a man not resisting, but resigning not to guilt, but to the gravity of a moment he'd prepared for his whole life. Within seconds, he was turned hands, pulled behind his back. The cuffs were tight, tighter than necessary. "You think you can outsmart the system," the officer muttered. Langston said nothing. The street was still empty. No one screamed. No one ran to his defense. But from behind a curtain on the third floor, a phone camera blinked red. The officer opened Langston's car door, pulled his leather satchel from the passenger seat, unzipped it, and dumped its contents onto the hood. Books, a flask, a folded note. Then the glint. A small gold badge. The officer froze. His fingers hovered. He picked it up, read, blinked. His face changed. Not out of reverence, but dread. It was a federal judiciary identification. Not expired. Not forged. And it bore a name that didn't just belong to history books. Langston Hill. The man who rewrote sections of constitutional oversight law. The man who vanished from the spotlight, but not from power. And now, he stood cuffed on Watermark Street, in front of a corner bookstore, beneath a city that thought it knew its silence well. But this silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was about to break. The badge hit the hood with a sound too quiet to explain what it set in motion. At first, the officer stared at it the way a child stares at a locked door he shouldn't have opened. The golden edges, slightly worn, but unmistakably real, bore the weight of federal authority. More than that, they bore a name the officer had never bothered to ask. Langston Hill. The same name on the ID, he had tossed aside the same man whose wrists he had bound with the ease of habit and assumption. For a moment the air between them grew too thick to breathe. The officer stood still, hands hovering as if the badge might change shape under his guilt. It didn't. Truth rarely does. Langston didn't move. His spine remained straight, his gaze unmoved. There was no gloating, no panic. Just presence. A presence that filled the street in a way flashing lights never could. From the sidewalk, a boy who had paused mid-walk raised his phone. Another witness. Then another. Soon, it wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a moment frozen in time, now captured from multiple angles. And still, Langston said nothing. He didn't need to. Within an hour, the video had begun its quiet crawl across social media platforms. There were no raised voices in the footage, no resistance. Just an old man arrested and searched like a suspect standing silently while his credentials to the highest level of judicial authority shimmered in the daylight. By noon, local news stations had picked up the footage. By evening, national outlets were digging into who he was. They found the trail he never wanted to leave behind. Law reform architect, former federal advisor, a man who had shaped the very standards the officer failed to uphold. The irony struck like lightning, and it struck a nerve. Because if someone like Langston Hill could be humiliated in plain sight, Then what chance did the nameless have the Charleston Police Department issued a statement? Unfortunate confusion, they called it. Standard stop gone wrong. But the public wasn't listening to press releases anymore. They were watching the video on loop, watching Langston's stillness, watching the officer fumble, watching the system expose itself without a single word from the man at the center. He remained silent, deliberately so. Langston didn't appear on television. He didn't accept interview requests. While the world reacted, he wrote. Not op-eds, not memoirs. He wrote legal drafts, sent memoranda to judicial oversight committees, filed requests for procedural records under FOIA. He wrote not to speak for himself, but to make the system explain itself. Behind closed doors, whispers began to turn. Inside law school's professors replaced their scheduled readings with an analysis of the video. In precinct lounges, some officers looked down when his name was spoken. Others scoffed. But everyone watched. In church halls, people gathered to talk, not about protest, but about power, about how quiet it can look when dignity is violated, about how often silence gets mistaken for weakness, and about the man who proved it wasn't. The young officer who cuffed Langston was placed on administrative leave, but it didn't stop the tide. What mattered wasn't punishment, it was proof. Proof that assumptions were lethal, that appearances were still a license for suspicion, and that even a federal badge could be overshadowed by skin and age and silence. Then another video emerged, a different angle, a closer look. It showed the officer unzipping Langston's leather satchel, tipping it out onto the hood, and sifting through it as if expecting something incriminating. But there was no threat, only a flask, a folded newspaper, a fountain pen, and that small official badge. The voice in the background belonged to a bystander. Soft and credulous. Is that real? Yes, it was real. And in that silence, the silence after the badge hit the metal. After the officer read the name, something shifted. It was not rage that moved the people. It was recognition. Because for the first time in a long time, they saw what dignity looked like when it wasn't allowed to speak, and how loud it could become when others chose to speak for it. Langston never asked for justice to be served. He only demanded that it be recognized. And that demand, quiet and steady as it was, became the spark. The badge was not the fire, but it lit the match, and the silence it broke would not settle again. Charleston had always prided itself on its ability to smile politely through discomfort. It was a city that knew how to dress wounds without disinfecting them. But on the third morning, after Langston Hill was wrongfully cuffed in the street, the wound refused to close. Because this time, the scar had a name, and the city could no longer pretend it hadn't seen the knife. It began not in press rooms or court chambers, but in the ordinary places that give a city its pulse. A high school teacher turned off the scheduled lesson plan and played the clip of Langston's arrest to his class. A barbershop downtown replaced sports talk with conversations about civil rights law. In the back rows of Sunday services, congregations whispered not just about sin, but about silence. Langston had not spoken, not to cameras, not to crowds, but the city began to speak for him. Not because he demanded it, but because the contrast between who he was and how he had been treated was too severe to ignore. It forced a question into every room. If Langston Hill could be mistaken for a threat, what hope was there for those who carried no title, no badge, no proof of legacy? Students at Charleston State University formed a coalition overnight. They didn't carry signs or march. Instead, they compiled a public archive, dozens of cases involving stop and search incidents, traffic detainments, unwarranted questioning, many with no footage, no witnesses. But now, with Langston's case as a catalyst, those names began to surface. People who had been dismissed as non-compliant, suspicious, or simply uncooperative suddenly became visible. Langston's silence had given them space. Civil rights organizations that had once been relegated to the outskirts of local influence were suddenly flooded with inquiries. Lawyers received handwritten letters from elderly residents who had never dared to file a complaint. Some included newspaper clippings from decades past. One had a single line underlined, "Man questioned on porch, mistaken for trespasser." The date read 1986. And yet, it wasn't just the public that began to listen. Inside the police department itself, cracks formed where loyalty once sealed shut every doubt. A young officer present during Langston's processing submitted a confidential memo to Internal Affairs. It was not a report of misconduct. It was a confession of complicity. I watched him sit there, handcuffed silent. I kept thinking he looked like my grandfather. And I did nothing. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry not because they wanted to, but because the silence in their own hallways had become unbearable. Anonymous officers began submitting evidence body cam footage, shift notes, radio logs. One included a 2-second clip where Langston's ID was clearly visible, and the arresting officer said, "Doesn't matter who he thinks he is. Out here I decide." That single line leaked, and it spread like oil in firelight. Langston never acknowledged it. He didn't need to. His response came not through rebuttal, but through structure. He reactivated contacts from his years in federal policy work. He reached out to academic colleagues, passed along documentation about judicial oversight failures, and asked for only one thing: help me make sure this doesn't vanish. At Charleston Law School, a group of students who had never met Langston gathered nightly to examine stop data and racial bias patterns. Their advisor, a professor who had once studied under Langston, gave them a quiet directive: don't prove the system failed because of him. Prove it was always failing. He just made it undeniable. In the city council chambers, nervous hands flipped through printed reports. The mayor's aides whispered about optics and reputation management. But one councilwoman herself, the daughter of a once jailed protester, stood up and said, "We don't need to manage our image. We need to manage our conscience." And so the hearings began. Not courtroom hearings, public ones. Town halls, forums, civil dialogues, where people who had never before spoken aloud their fear of traffic stops now recounted them in trembling detail. One man, mid-50s, recounted how he was pulled over 3 times in 1 year on the same block. He never filed a report. I thought if I kept my head down, I'd survive. The room was silent after that. Not out of apathy, but because too many people understood. Langston Hill did not attend those hearings. He remained where he had always been, in the quiet, making the system listen, not through volume, but through credibility. In a quiet office near the university, he met with a team of young legal researchers. They handed him printouts of statistical evidence they had compiled from public records, racial disparities, unexplained use of forced language patterns in police reports. He did not thank them. He simply said, "Good. Now connect it." And they did. They traced patterns: officers with disproportionately high stop rates, precincts with low complaint follow-up internal affairs, reports closed within 24 hours. What began as a local reckoning took shape as a potential federal case. Meanwhile, the media began to shift tone, no longer framing Langston as a retired federal advisor or wrongfully detained man, but instead, the man whose silence taught a city to speak. An opinion piece from a nationally syndicated columnist read, "If dignity had a sound, it would be the absence of defense when injustice speaks too loudly to ignore." Charleston, for the first time in a long time, was listening. And it wasn't just listening to Langston, it was listening to itself. To the voices it had dismissed, the complaints it had archived without action, the citizens it had profiled without apology. One evening, a mural appeared near Watermark Street. No name, just a silhouette of an elderly man standing straight with cuffed hands and the words, "We were wrong." It was not vandalism. It was the beginning of memory. And in that memory, a city began to rebuild, not its image, but its integrity. Because the silence that once insulated its comfort had been broken. Not with a scream, but with a pause long enough to force the question, what do we do when the man we humiliated was never the one who needed to learn a lesson? They called it a community inquiry, but everyone knew it was something else. It wasn't a trial. There were no judges, no juries, no robes, no gavels. But it felt heavier than any courtroom Langston Hill had ever stood in, because this wasn't about law. It was about truth. And truth doesn't always wait for permission to speak. The gymnasium turned hearing room buzzed with a kind of reverence. Folding chairs lined up in tight rows. A microphone on a low stage. Local officials, clergy students, retired officers, and survivors of silence all sat elbow to elbow. There was no docket, no prosecutorial dance, just people, testifying not under oath, but under memory. Langston sat near the back. He didn't sit in the center, didn't claim the podium. He'd already given the city everything he needed to give his name, his stillness, his refusal to disappear. Now it was their turn. His presence was permission. The first to speak was a young woman, mid-20s, trembling slightly. As she recounted the time she was pulled over, just blocks from her home, made to sit on the curb while her groceries melted in the summer heat. "He kept asking me where I got the car," she said. "It's mine. I saved for it for 4 years. I worked 2 jobs." Her voice broke. No one interrupted. Next came an elderly man who had lived in the city since the 1960s. "It's not new," he said. "The uniform changes, the words get fancier, but the suspicion, it's always there. You just learn to shrink, so it doesn't see you." The microphone passed from hand to hand. A high school teacher, a delivery driver, a former sergeant who said the quiet part out loud. Sometimes the pressure isn't direct. It's implied. You see which officers get promoted. You see which ones get asked to keep their mouths shut. You learn how to look away. What made this gathering so powerful was not the volume of outrage, it was its clarity. No one yelled. No one blamed the whole for the acts of one. But they named the pattern. And the pattern had grown too wide, too visible to be dismissed as isolated. Langston watched it unfold like a tapestry long hidden in a dusty attic, now stretched across the walls of a place that had always known better, but done less. Midway through the day, a new speaker stepped forward, Officer Carla Jameson. She had been with the department for 18 years. Black, measured, decorated. She cleared her throat before she spoke, and for a second, the room leaned forward. "I've worn the badge longer than I haven't. I love this city. I love what policing can be. But I also know what it is. Her voice did not tremble. I watched that video of Mr. Hill like everyone else. I wasn't surprised. I was ashamed that I wasn't surprised. She paused. There are people in this department who do good work, but they do it while swimming against a current, and the current is fed by silence. Every time we protect an image, instead of the people, we reinforce the very thing that divides us. It wasn't an apology. It was a diagnosis, and it mattered more than any policy reform draft could. The community inquiry extended for 3 days. No subpoenas, no verdicts, just testimony. And what surfaced in that space without cross-examination or defense was a city's collective unease finally allowed to breathe. After the final speaker stepped down, there was no applause, just quiet, heavy and honest. Langston walked home alone. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting their pale glow across the sidewalks he had once tread unnoticed. Now he moved through them like a man both remembered and redefined. He had not asked to be the symbol, but symbols are rarely chosen. They are created by the conditions that need them. In the days that followed, the ripple effect reached institutions that had remained comfortably uninvolved. Charleston's Judicial Review Board reopened cases involving excessive force complaints. The Police Academy introduced mandatory racial bias training based on case study models, including Langston's. Law schools invited him not to lecture, but to listen and to help design new ethics frameworks rooted not just in legality, but in human dignity. He accepted reluctantly, not because he craved a return to relevance, but because he understood that influence without application was simply memory. And he was tired of being remembered. He wanted to be useful. His work was quiet, methodical. He reviewed hiring practices, internal discipline structures, officer evaluation metrics. He spoke little, but wrote constantly. He consulted with oversight committees, drafted constitutional interpretations, and outlined civilian review protocols in plain language, not for lawyers, but for citizens. Meanwhile, the officer who arrested him underwent formal review. It wasn't just about his actions that day, it was about a pattern. A career dotted with assumptions, a file padded with unofficial warnings. His future in law enforcement now rested not on one decision, but on a system beginning to find its voice. And Charleston slowly, awkwardly, but genuinely kept listening. It added new civilian seats to the Police Accountability Board. It held its first open training review attended by community observers. It began the work of auditing traffic stops by demographic, and most significantly made the findings public. None of it was perfect. None of it was enough. But it was a start. Langston Hill, the man without a gavel, had sat silently through testimony that no courtroom had the courage to hold. And in doing so, he reminded the city that justice does not always arrive with the bang of a hammer. Sometimes it enters on soft shoes. Sometimes it speaks only when we stop trying to win the argument and start trying to hear the wound. And when that happens, even a city that once refused to listen may finally begin to change. Langston Hill never asked to be remembered. That's what made it impossible to forget him. In the months following the community inquiry, Charleston changed in ways few expected, not all at once and not loudly. There were no grand speeches, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The city shifted like a tide, subtly, steadily, until those who had lived on the shore their whole lives noticed that the waterline had moved. Langston still walked the same routes every morning, Jefferson Avenue to Watermark Street, past the bookstore, through the park, then home again before noon. But people no longer passed him by without recognition. They nodded. Some greeted him by name. A few simply slowed down, uncertain whether to say something or whether silence was the only proper way to honor a man who had taught them what silence could do. He never waved off the attention, but he didn't invite it either. What he had to say, he'd already said without speaking. And now, the system was answering back. At the heart of the city's reform was a document Langston co-authored, but refused to put his name on. It was a procedural overhaul civilian review, processes mandatory body cam audits, expanded anti-bias training designed not by outside consultants, but by a coalition of legal scholars, community members, and current officers. The language was precise, the tone direct, and though it bore no official stamp of authorship, everyone who read it knew whose fingerprints shaped its spine. Charleston's police department didn't crumble under pressure it bent. And in that bending came realignment. Officers were retrained under new evaluative systems. Community liaisons, once symbolic roles, were given real authority. Traffic stop data was reviewed quarterly and shared publicly with community forums held afterward to discuss trends and outliers. It didn't solve everything. It didn't erase what had already happened. But it put the truth under a light no one could dim again. One evening, months after the reforms began taking effect, a young officer stopped Langston on the sidewalk, not for a search, not for suspicion, just a conversation. I joined because I believed in what it could be, the officer said, shifting nervously on his feet. But I never saw how it actually was. Until you. Langston didn't smile. He simply nodded, then asked, "What will you do with what you see now?" The question hung in the air. It didn't require an answer. It required reflection. Across the country, other cities began referencing Charleston's reforms. Legal publications highlighted the city's transparency model as a potential blueprint. National conferences invited Langston to speak, but he declined them all. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol for a movement. He was interested in seeing whether a city could maintain momentum once the cameras left. Instead, he spent his time mentoring a small group of students. Law, sociology, ethics, gathered weekly in a quiet classroom. No press, no fanfare. They asked him questions. He rarely answered directly. He taught them to listen, before reacting to read between policies to see both the law and the loopholes people slip through. One evening, a student asked him why he never took legal action against the officer who had arrested him. Langston paused. "Because consequences are fleeting," he said. "But awareness, that changes generations." And I wasn't harmed. I was revealed. What they did wasn't personal. It was habitual. The system didn't fail me. It exposed itself to me, and that's a gift I had the tools to do something with. His students sat in silence. It was the kind of silence Langston had always believed in, not rooted in fear or avoidance, but in depth. The kind of silence that absorbs truth and reshapes it into something enduring. In neighborhoods, once defined by mistrust, block associations began to form partnerships with precinct leaders. Coffee hours between officers and residents became regular gatherings. Not because everything was fixed, but because people had seen what happened when you stop pretending nothing's broken. One morning, a little boy ran up to Langston outside the bookstore. He couldn't have been older than 8. He held out a wooden keychain, hand-carved rough around the edges. It bore 3 words, "Stand even cuffed." Langston took it gently. The phrase had emerged online months earlier, started by someone he had never met. It appeared on murals, protest signs, t-shirts, but seeing it in a child's hands brought it into a different focus. Not just a message, a legacy. He carried that keychain with him everywhere after. In the end, Langston Hill didn't rewrite laws or topple governments. He didn't lead marches or ignite riots. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He simply didn't bow. And that refusal, quiet, deliberate, unshaken, forced an entire city to kneel before its own reflection. Systems do not change because of noise alone. They change when the silence they depend on stops cooperating, when dignity refuses to perform, when the most powerful person in the room is the one who says nothing and still gets heard. Charleston would never be the same again, because the man they once misjudged had become the measure by which they now judge themselves. And the quiet that changed the system was never an absence. It was a presence too full to ignore. Langston Hill never shouted. He never marched. He didn't lead rallies or hold signs above his head. And yet through his stillness, his refusal to bend, and the quiet integrity of a life lived without apology, he reshaped the soul of a city. It began with a single morning, an ordinary routine shattered by a traffic stop, rooted not in legality, but in perception. A respected former federal advisor, Langston was handcuffed on a quiet street for no reason other than being a black man who didn't shrink. But rather than respond with outrage, he responded with something more disarming dignity. He allowed the system to reveal itself, not through confrontation, but by refusing to deny his humanity. What followed was unexpected, a video gone viral, a community awakening, and a city compelled to listen. Charleston, long practiced in the art of polite denial, could no longer ignore what had happened. The truth wasn't just in Langston's story, but in the stories it drew to the surface everyday citizens who had endured similar humiliations, officers who had looked the other way, and a justice system that had gone deaf to the people it served. Langston said little. Instead, he moved purposefully. He worked behind the scenes, guided young lawyers, shared documents, designed reforms. His silence created space for testimony, for confession, for reckoning. And in that space, change took root. The police department restructured. Review boards gained civilian voices. Data became transparent. Students learned to read power not just in laws, but in the behaviors they enable. In the final stretch of his journey, Langston remained where he always had been, not in the spotlight, but just outside of it, shaping its direction. A mural was painted, a phrase was born, "Stand even cuffed," and a boy handed him a handmade keychain bearing those words. That was the echo of legacy. That was the sound of a life not just remembered, but honored. From a wrongful arrest grew something radical, accountability, truth, and above all, hope. Not because Langston was exceptional, but because he refused to let the system treat him as disposable. He proved that quiet is not weakness, it is wisdom, and that justice does not always need noise to be heard, it needs presence. Langston Hill's story teaches us something profound. You do not need to scream to be powerful. In a world obsessed with volume, sometimes the most revolutionary act is stillness. His refusal to flinch in the face of injustice sent a louder message than anger ever could. And in doing so, he gave others the courage to speak because dignity once seen is hard to forget. This story reminds us that real change starts not with mass movements, but with individual moments of truth. With people like Langston, who stand firm even when the system leans against them. It urges us to stay awake to what is happening around us, to use our voices when we must, and our silence when it serves a greater truth. Wherever you are in your workplace, in your neighborhood, in your daily routine, you can choose to stand like Langston did. Speak up when others stay silent. Listen when the world demands a quick judgment. Carry your dignity with you not as armor, but as invitation. Let your presence remind others that justice is not abstract, it is lived breath by breath, choice by choice. And when the moment comes, when you're called to decide between comfort and conscience, choose the path that echoes. If this story moved you, if you felt something stir in your heart or your memory, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling stories that matter, stories that don't just entertain, but inspire. With your support, we can continue exploring powerful narratives like Langston Hill's and together build a world that listens. Subscribe now, because silence, when used wisely, can still change the world.